Indirect object pronouns, complementos de objetos indirectos. In this lecture, you will learn what indirect object pronouns are in English and in Spanish, but the focus will really be on putting sentences together in Spanish that have indirect objects and how you can use their complements or their pronouns. The thing with Spanish is that Spanish has a little bit of a redundancy when it uses indirect object pronouns that English does not have, so beware, this is one of those topics where the structure of Spanish differs from that of English. Let's get started. It's good to go over simple sentence structure here so that we really understand what an indirect object is. So first, let's review what a direct object is. If I say Miss Andrea gives homework, which I do, the subject is Miss Andrea. The verb is gives, and homework is the direct object. If we break down what each one of those segments is for, this is what we get. The subject is the person or thing doing the action. So who's giving the homework here? It's Miss Andrea. So Miss Andrea is the subject. The verb is the action itself, and the action here is giving. So Miss Andrea gives, and then the direct object is the person or thing that is directly affected by the action. So what is being given? So if you ask yourself, looking at the verb, what is being given, your answer is homework, therefore that is the direct object. It is being affected. So again, the doer of the action, and the affected party. And just to reiterate, one good way to figure out what the direct object of a sentence is, and of course not all sentences have direct objects, but to figure it out you would look at the verb and ask yourself who or what is being given. So what is actually being given to somebody else, and that would be the homework. Let's expand this a little bit and add an indirect object to the sentence. So now what I've done is I've added the word us to the same sentence. So here's our us. And this right here is an indirect object. You might be able to figure out on your own what the role is. So if Miss Andrea is doing the action, it's the subject. The action is gives. Homework is the direct object. It's the person being directly affected by the action. The indirect object is the person or thing that is indirectly affected by the action, but most importantly, it is receiving the direct object. So if I were to illustrate it a little bit better, I would say that the subject is doing the verb is affecting the direct object, and then the direct object is being given or is being also further passed along to the indirect object. Okay, so who is Miss Andrea, or to whom is Miss Andrea giving homework? To us. So the question you're going to ask yourself to figure out what an indirect object is to whom or for whom. So Miss Andrea gives homework. To whom? To us. And that's your indirect object. Here are some English examples that are going to help you understand the Spanish that's coming up pretty soon. Some of you know indirect object pronouns pretty well in English already and indirect objects. So I want to point out that the way that we talk about indirect objects in Spanish does differ from how we do in English. So if something sounds incorrect, just make sure you understand that it is indeed related to how we would use it in Spanish, this lecture. Okay, so Andrea talked to her mother and father. This one doesn't have a direct object because we're not saying what was talked or what was spoken. We are indeed asking ourselves to whom or for whom was the talking that Andrea did, and that was to mother and father. So this is our indirect object. If you shorten it, you are putting it in pronoun form. That's the idea here. So you can shorten her mother and father and just say them. This would then be acting as an indirect object pronoun. For the next example, which I think is a little bit better than the first, I have to buy tickets for my friends. Actually, here we could even find the direct object. What do I have to buy? Tickets, so that's our direct object. And then to whom and for whom are these tickets? For my friends. That would answer the question of what's the indirect object. So for my friends are the indirect object. If I didn't feel like saying my friends over and over, I could just shorten it into a pronoun form, and that could be them. Therefore, in this sentence what I did is I used the pronoun. I have to buy tickets for them. Just to be aware, in English you could actually get rid of the for and say, I have to buy them tickets. Okay, so you can buy tickets for them or you can buy them the tickets. So there are two ways to do this in English. And now let's work our way toward understanding this concept in Spanish. So here's a little sentence that we can use as an example. She pays $200. I know $200 is a direct object because if I look at the verb, I ask myself what is being paid, and that's the $200. And then I can add to it and I could say to whom or for whom is this payment of $200. And that would be our indirect object. I can say she pays $200 to me. I can say to you. I can say to Carlos, whoever Carlos is, to Anita and John. And then if I wanted to shorten these guys, these indirect objects, I could use the pronouns and say she pays me $200, she pays you $200, she pays him $200, or she pays them $200, instead of saying the very long to me, to you, to Carlos, to Anita and John. So again, if I were to re-explain this, these guys right here are your indirect objects that you could plug into the sentence if you wanted to, and these guys right here are the shortened version or the pronoun version of them. So the question now is, how do we put me, you, him, them in Spanish? So what are the indirect objects in Spanish? And here's the list of indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Me, te, le, nos, les. So if you wanted to replace for me or to me, you could use me. If you wanted to replace to you or for you, you could use te. Another example, let's say you're saying for Maria. So I give, or I did this for Maria, or I give the money to Maria. You could replace Maria and just say le, which would be the equivalent of her. So you get the idea of how to use these. And also, they should look slightly familiar. They should look like the ones that you use for gustar. If you remember, a mí me gusta, te gusta, le gusta, nos gusta, les gusta. These are the same exact indirect object pronouns that you use with gustar. You might not have known that they were indirect object pronouns, but now you do. And if you remember correctly, you could add a little of extra information for each one of these if you wanted to. So for me, you could also have added a mí me gusta, a ti te gusta, a él, you could also write whoever él's name would be, so a José le gusta, and so forth. These right here are really for emphasis. They're not that important. What's important is for you to have the indirect object pronoun. You should remember this from gustar. So you could say a mí me gusta, but really you could just say me gusta by itself. This is going to stand true when we use indirect object pronouns in other types of sentences. So remember, you've already used these indirect object pronouns. So now that you know that, they should be a little less scary, even though I will tell you that at first when I start showing you how to put the sentences together, it looks confusing. Again, you should find some comfort in the fact that you've already used it with gustar. So if you say, I like to take my passport when I go on a trip, believe it or not, that's not what you're saying in Spanish. We just couldn't tell you that when you were being taught in the very beginning of Spanish 1 because that would make you go crazy, that there's no way to say, I like to take my passport when I go on a trip. Instead, in Spanish, this is the verb to be pleasing. So what you're really saying is, instead of I like, you're saying, to me, it is pleasing to take my passport when I go on a trip. So you might see that in that sentence, in this one right here, there is an indirect object. It is pleasing to take my passport. What is pleasing? To take my passport. Okay? To whom is it pleasing? To me. That's your indirect object. And to show you what happens in Spanish when there's an indirect object, you've got to have your little me, and you can add the a mí if you want to, but you don't have to. Same's going to go when I show you what the other types of sentences with indirect object pronouns look like. You're going to use the indirect object pronoun. That'll be mandatory, otherwise it won't make sense. You can't say yo gusta, and you can't say just gusta without the me at all. You learned this in the beginning of Spanish 1. But you can also, if you want to, So you have to have the me, but if you want to add some emphasis, you could say a mí. If you want to leave it out, you can do it too. That we will call option 2. So let's relate this concept to other sentences and see what you can do. So if I say now, Miss Andrea gives homework to us, we already discussed that what is being given is your direct object. We're not replacing that right now. Right now we're dealing with the indirect, which is to whom the homework is being given, and that is to us. If I were to write out the sentence in Spanish, this is what it'll look like. Señorita Andrea nos da tarea a nosotros. So I will put a little number 1 here so you can see that these translations or that these two sentences are related. Señorita Andrea nos da tarea a nosotros. Okay, so now let's break it down. The to us is a nosotros. That part is actually optional, just like it is in gustar. The nos, which is what goes with the to us and will eventually become us by itself, is not optional. Just like nos gusta, you can't get rid of the nos, but you could add the a nosotros if you wanted to. The rule is that the indirect object pronoun, so I'm going to now do my little arrow in red, the indirect object pronoun right here, nos, goes in front of the conjugated verb. In this case, gives, the infinitive is dar, and we conjugated it da for Señorita Andrea. If I wanted to shorten it, I could just get rid of the a nosotros and say Señorita Andrea nos da tarea. To see this with some more notes, in Spanish, if the sentence has an indirect object, that's the to us, it must always have an indirect object pronoun inside of that sentence. So just like with gusta, you have to have the nos. If there's an indirect object in the sentence, the to us, you have to have the nos. You will in all the other sentences in Spanish that have indirect object pronouns. They always accompany each other. So if there's an indirect object in the sentence, you must have the pronoun. Okay? But the pronoun can also stand alone. So it is just mandatory to have the pronoun. If you have the indirect object in there as well, great. If not, that's fine. You can leave it out. So the first placement of your indirect object is that it goes in front of, or the indirect object pronoun rather, it goes in front of the conjugated verb, the action. There is a second placement too. So let's say you have a more complex sentence, all right, and in this more complex sentence, you've got something like ir plus a plus infinitive or tener plus que plus infinitive. The reason that those are more complex is because you now will have a conjugated verb, ir or tener, and then you will have an infinitive verb. So your placement of your indirect object is going to be slightly different for these. Just to review, ir plus a plus infinitive is saying that you're going to do something, and tener plus que plus infinitive is saying that you have to do something. So let me give you an example. The flight attendant has to give sodas to the passengers. Let's just remind ourselves, what does the flight attendant have to give? If in your head you're answering sodas, that's correct, and sodas is our direct object. So now we're going to ask ourselves, to whom or for whom are these sodas? The passengers. So the passengers is our indirect object of the sentence. If I put that sentence in Spanish, because it has an indirect object, I also have to find the indirect object pronoun that goes with it. And if you look on your list, to the passengers, it's just like saying to them, so you know that it will be mandatory to have the word les in my sentence in Spanish. If I also want to add a los pasajeros, fine, but it absolutely does not have to be there. So like I said, we have to have the word les, and this is what it should look like. El auxiliar de vuelo les tiene que dar refrescos a los pasajeros. So you can have a los pasajeros in there, but what's really important is that you have les in there. Notice I put it in front of the conjugated verb. Now, if I want to use this sentence down here where I don't say to the passengers, that whole long thing, I could just cross off to the passengers and end up with this sentence right here. El auxiliar de vuelo les tiene que dar refrescos. The second placement, because this is one of those sentences that is complex, we've got the tener plus que plus infinitive. You could, like I said, put it in front of the conjugated verb, or, and I'm sure this will come as no surprise if you really understand the direct object pronouns, you can attach it to the infinitive in the sentence and say, el auxiliar de vuelo tiene que darles refrescos a los pasajeros. You could also, like I said before, get rid of a los pasajeros and end up with this sentence much shorter. El auxiliar de vuelo tiene que darles refrescos. And to see it all as one slide and also get some extra notes, if the sentence has a verb in the infinitive, it's not the true action, that's what infinitive means, the indirect object pronoun can also be attached to the end of the infinitive. So to review, in placement 1, you put the indirect object pronoun in front of the conjugated verb. In placement 2, you can attach it to an infinitive in the sentence if there is an infinitive in the sentence, and an infinitive will only be in the sentence if you've got these kinds of constructions that are a little bit more complex. In addition, anytime you have an indirect object in the sentence, you absolutely have to have its pronoun. So if you have a los pasajeros in your sentence, you have to have the pronoun. But at the very least, you must have an indirect object pronoun in your sentence if one is required. Tu turno. Now that was a lot of information. Let's see what you can do on your own with this information. Complete the sentence with the appropriate indirect object pronoun for number 1. For number 2, complete the sentence with the appropriate missing elements. And number 3, what would be another way of writing number 2? Buena suerte!